From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with what rubs off when a political candidate rubs shoulders with the president. Now there are 3 days left before state and local elections all over the country, so things are getting pretty intense out there. President Bush was out on the road today trying to boost Republicans into office in Virginia and in New Jersey today. Mr. Bush was supporting gubernatorial candidates, and he was doing so by emphasizing the same themes which helped to elect him last November. The same themes save one. There wasn't a lot of talk today about abortion. Here's ABC's John Martin.
In Virginia, Bush was pushing Marshall Coleman, a former state attorney general, for governor.
Make these last days count for Marshall Coleman, for Virginia, and for the United States of America.
In New Jersey, it was James Courter, a congressman.
Jim Courter knows what's good for New Jersey's future.
In nearby New York City, meanwhile, Mr. Bush has been raising funds for Rudolph Giuliani, the former U.S. attorney who wants to be mayor. In all 3 elections, according to the polls, the president is on the losing side. There are a lot of reasons. One common issue is abortion. The president has vetoed federal funds for abortions for victims of rape or incest. Not only did the president avoid mentioning his position on abortion today, but the candidates have been changing theirs. In New York City, Giuliani personally opposes abortion, but says he won't try to change the city's policy. Last year, the city spent $7 million on abortions for poor women. In New Jersey, Courter started as an abortion opponent, but now says he will not oppose a woman's right to choose an abortion. In Virginia, Coleman did much the same. With Republicans now likely to lose in all 3 races, why is the president risking his prestige?
It never hurts the president to help his party. And this president's going to always help his party.
The president is probably in almost a no-win situation. I mean, I think if he doesn't go out and campaign for these people, he's going to be accused of not doing enough. If he campaigns and they lose, they're going to say he doesn't have any coattails.
The president isn't conceding any of the races, and some analysts believe that Virginia could still be won. But the likelihood is that what the president did today will have almost no effect on what voters do next week. John Martin, ABC News, Washington.
In the Virginia governor's race, abortion has been more controversial than any other issue of substance. And to a large extent, it has prevented race from becoming an issue in the campaign. ABC's Jim Wooten is in Virginia.
Every day, Colonial Williamsburg makes a little Virginia history for the tourist. And every day, Douglas Wilder makes a little Virginia history for himself.
On November the 7th, I will be elected the next governor of Virginia. God bless.
If he is, he'd be the first black governor ever elected in the country. A genuine milestone for a state that was once a citadel of the old Confederacy, where integration was fiercely resisted. Now, says Wilder, racism's part of the past, and his Republican opponent, Marshall Coleman, agrees.
I've been a staunch supporter of civil rights since I was in college. And so I think sometimes the image of Virginia doesn't quite match the reality.
This week, though, Coleman did accuse the media of giving Wilder special treatment because he is black. Still, the reality is that abortion, not race, does seem to be the principal issue. Wilder defends it as a woman's right. Coleman doesn't, and most polls suggest that has cost him considerable support. He may also have hurt himself with a negative television attack on Wilder's integrity as a politician, as a property owner, and as an attorney.
Is that the kind of man we want for governor?
It has been the most vitriolic mass media campaign in Virginia's political history.
He's at it again. Marshall Coleman's launched another vicious negative ad campaign of false attacks and distortions.
This week, Coleman pledged a positive approach for the final days of the campaign, but his negative advertising continued nevertheless.
Mr. Wilder voted 3 times to allow rapists and their attorneys to grill the victim.
Who started this?
He did.
Fact is, I have not and will not engage in negative campaigning.
Coleman is running as a Reagan-Bush Republican. On the other hand, Wilder has tried to distance himself from such national Democrats as Michael Dukakis and Jesse Jackson, tried to position himself not as an ethnic liberal, but as a mainstream moderate. If that works, he could make more than a little history here next week. Jim Wooten, ABC News, Alexandria, Virginia.
In a moment, we'll go overseas. East Germany agrees to allow another group of refugees to leave right away for the West. And later in the broadcast, there's still no end of the line in sight for a railroad of sewage. And we'll have our person of the week giving his best and then some. In East Germany today, another sign of change and an appeal for patience. The new East German leader, Egon Krenz, went on nationwide television tonight to announce the retirement of 5 Politburo members, and he went on to ask East Germans not to leave their country for the West. Still, they do, most recently crowding once again into the West German embassy in the Czechoslovakian capital of Prague. And the word from there tonight is that the latest group of East Germans will be allowed to leave immediately for West Germany. Here's ABC's Jerry King.
The situation here at the West German embassy had become critical. Refugees occupied almost every bit of available floor space. They were mostly young, of course. East Germany is losing what sometimes seems to be a whole generation, perhaps even 2. One East German refugee described conditions here today as very, very bad. Most of the people don't get much food, he said, and they cannot wash. But the refugees have been taking these overcrowded conditions stoically, hoping they would be temporary, hoping the 2 Germanys would work out the kind of agreement announced tonight that all can go without formalities, without the slow process of having their papers checked, without having to renounce their East German citizenship. Even these refugees will go. Several of them have served time in East German jails. Their offense, they'd been caught in earlier attempts to flee their country. This man said he'd been beaten in prison. Some who arrived late tonight found the embassy front door temporarily closed. In panic, they opted to scramble over the back fence in hopes of being part of tomorrow's departure. More refugees are expected to reach here this weekend. They can only hope that a precedent has now been set and that passage to the West will become easier. Jerry King, ABC News, Prague, Czechoslovakia.
Well, the winds of change are stirring almost everywhere in Eastern Europe. Today in Bulgaria, more than 4,000 people marched outside the parliament buildings to demand democracy. It was the biggest anti-government protest in Bulgaria since World War II. In Poland, the government has ended subsidies to political parties, including the Communist Party. From now on, said one cabinet minister, all parties will have to survive without special privileges. And at the United Nations today, for the first time, the U.S. and the Soviet Union co-sponsored a resolution. The resolution urged all nations to respect human rights and uphold the principles of the UN Charter. In Nicaragua today, there was more talking than shooting, and the talk was of another ceasefire. The Sandinista government of Nicaragua offered to meet with leaders of the Contras at the United Nations in an effort to negotiate another ceasefire. The Contras have apparently agreed, but said they need time to prepare for such a meeting. ABC's Peter Collins is in Managua.
Are preparing to go to the United Nations with one item on the agenda, one objective, establishing a firm timetable for disbanding the Contras.
To begin the process of Contra dismantlement as agreed to by the Central American presidents last August.
Daniel Ortega was taking a big risk when he chose last week's hemispheric meeting of Democratic leaders to announce he was suspending Nicaragua's year-and-a-half-old ceasefire. He took heavy criticism, but the Sandinistas say their point was to jolt world opinion into dealing with the forgotten problem, the Contras.
Saving lives is worth shocking the international community, and that's what it's all about, saving lives.
As for the Contras, with the U.S. Congress not about to rearm them, they seem to be left with little choice but to negotiate. In a week, the Sandinistas have turned the tables. The issue is no longer the prospects for a free election in Nicaragua next February. It's when are the Contras going to be disbanded? Peter Collins, ABC News, Managua.
Elsewhere in the world, an oil drilling ship is missing in the Gulf of Thailand. The oil company Unocal says that its ship, the Seacrest, with 97 people on board, disappeared today in the middle of a typhoon. We'll have more news in just a moment. For the second time in 2 weeks, the United States Senate has voted to remove a federal judge from office. Judge Walter Nixon, Jr. of Mississippi was impeached after being convicted of lying to a federal grand jury. Our next report is another of those vivid examples of this country's dilemma when it comes to finding ways of disposing of solid waste. You may remember 2 years ago when a barge loaded with garbage from New York was forced to sail up and down the East Coast looking for a place to unload. Well, for the past 3 weeks, a train loaded with sewage A train, that is, from Baltimore, has been traveling from town to town in Louisiana. Nobody wants it. Here's Kathleen Dulaski.
Last night, the sludge train left Louisiana because no town here would accept its cargo.
We don't need this, and I'm tickled to death that is leaving us.
On board is 43,000 tons of Baltimore's sewage. A contractor brought the sludge to its landfill near Donaldsonville, Louisiana. But when the train arrived, residents complained that the wet waste smelled, and town officials decided it violated environmental regulations.
I believe it's an insult to the citizens of Louisiana that we have to suffer with this material in our neighborhoods.
The sludge train rolled through 3 towns south of Baton Rouge. Each time it was told to get out.
Now, Baltimore's waste is Baltimore's, and they ought to deal with it.
But Baltimore says it's in no position to take the sludge back. This sewage treatment plant, where it originated, is under a court order to remove 210,000 tons of sludge by November 30th.
If we would accept that sludge back, it would interfere with the operation of our court order, and we couldn't meet the court order that we're under.
The court order was imposed because residents who live near this huge facility also complained about the smell caused by increasing amounts of sludge. The amount of sludge generated nationwide is expected to double in the next decade. But more and more states are refusing to accept out-of-state sewage. And Louisiana officials say now they may join the ranks. Early today, the sludge train stopped in Pascagoula, Mississippi, but only long enough for contractors to deodorize the waste. Even with promises that it will smell better, there are still no takers. Kathleen Dulaski, ABC News, Baltimore.
The White House said today there should be a pay raise for members of Congress, for federal judges, and for senior members of the executive branch. The president's spokesman says Mr. Bush would like to see any pay raise tied to a tough new ethics bill limiting outside income. Hard times at the Chrysler Corporation. The number 3 car maker announced today that it will lay off 4,000 workers at 3 plants. It will also stop producing the subcompact Dodge Omni and the Plymouth Horizon. Chrysler said it was necessary because of slow sales and tough competition. On Wall Street, the prices drifted lower today. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell a little more than 2 points. The trading was fairly slow. Here's what it looked like for the week. The Industrial Average showing a gain of nearly 33 points. In our next segment, a new look at the siege of the American Embassy in Tehran. That's 10 years ago this weekend. Here's an example of how time marches on. It will be 10 years tomorrow since those so-called students clambered over the wall of the American Embassy in downtown Tehran. There was no way of knowing that morning how American foreign policy would soon be paralyzed, how Jimmy Carter would ultimately lose the presidency. And now, 10 years later, and for the first time, we have a chance to take a look at what happened that morning from a slightly different perspective. Here's ABC's John McCarthy.
The day started like so many others that chaotic fall in 1979, yet another demonstration outside the gates of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. These are exclusive photographs shot in the first hours by one of the so-called students who participated in the takeover. The pictures were smuggled out of Iran only this year. Former hostage Barry Rosen was the embassy public affairs officer.
I was approximately either in this office or in this one, right there, looking directly out my window, and people had climbed over the walls, moved the security guards aside, and then opened the gate.
There had been a security review of the embassy just months before. New bars had gone up on the lower windows.
Interestingly and ironically, these became the prison bars of our cells for several months.
The Marine Guards did what they could to slow the advance of the mob, but even the Marines, after using tear gas to defend the Chancery, had to give up along with everyone else.
The blindfold hit my face and then I thought very much about, I was about to leave for home in about a month, and I wondered if I would be able to be home by then. It started to rain, and the rain was getting heavier and heavier, and I said to myself, well, it seems to fit the day.
The demonstrators used a blowtorch to cut open the door of the embassy vault, where they found shredded secret documents and the cryptographic machines the embassy used for confidential communications with Washington. As that first day wore on, and in the many to follow, the hostages could always hear the anger of the crowd outside.
But I think the worst and traumatic part of it all was the constant crescendo of Marg Bar America day in and day out. Death to America, death to America. We felt it wherever we were in the embassy.
It would be 444 days before the hostages would come home, 444 days that crippled the nation and brought down a president. John McWethy, ABC News, Washington.
Time marches on. Our final segment in just a moment.
World News Tonight with Peter Jennings and the Person of the Week are brought to you by Citicorp.
Just before we end the broadcast in our regular Friday way, a word about two people who have died, who made a very big difference in our profession. Dorothy Fuldheim died in Cleveland today. She was 96. She was one of the very first women in America to be a professional broadcaster, the first woman ever to be a commentator on ABC radio, first in radio and then at WEWS television, the ABC affiliate in Cleveland. Dorothy got thousands and thousands of people to talk about themselves, even Adolf Hitler and every American president since FDR. And Sid Dobish has died. You'd know him by his pictures. From Vietnam to Woodstock, from the Middle East to the North Pole, Sid took some of the most compelling pictures that any of us at ABC News ever used to tell the stories we covered. He was a cameraman here for 26 years. He was brave and he was creative. He had a marvelous sense of what made a great picture. And he had that very special quality which led people to act naturally even when the camera was on. And now a person who impressed us this week with his efforts to make a difference. He's one of those people who gets attention automatically. It'll be obvious why. But we thought it about time to recognize the less obvious contribution he makes to his fellow man. We are also impressed with modesty. And this is a person who doesn't ask to be thanked and never demands gratitude.
It would be very helpful to me if people understood that what they see up there in celluloid has nothing to do with me. Well, here we go. Fast and loose. One ball, corner pocket.
In other words, if people confuse Paul Newman the movie star with Paul Newman the man, then they don't know much about the man.
They told me about you.
Of course he's recognized everywhere he goes. After all, he's been on the stage and television and in the movies for more than 30 years.
And now to tell you with candor and with clarity that you should buy a lot because our profits go to charity.
The less obvious man we were talking about, that is Paul Newman, the philanthropist. Since 1982, Newman's Own, the company that makes his own salad dressing and spaghetti sauce and popcorn, has donated $22 million to charity. This week, $250,000 more, along with 5 tons of spaghetti sauce, to the Red Cross Earthquake Fund in Northern California.
Contribution of that amount is enough to take care of the mass feeding that we're doing in the shelters for about 4 or 5 days.
And elsewhere in the country, a major benefactor of this school for the children of migrant workers in Florida, Paul Newman.
Paul Newman has been like a rescuer.
Who built this camp in Connecticut for children with cancer? Paul Newman.
Paul has taken an active involvement in every single activity at the camp.
Why has he given so much?
Why not? I don't need it.
Paul's very private. Paul is reticent to exploit any of this.
The author A.E. Hotchner is Newman's business partner.
Newman was very vain about his salad dressing. He made it for years and he wanted to have the world enjoy it. So he made a few bottles to give away, sell virtually in Westport. And it exploded. Paul said, wait a minute, this is pretty tacky. I'm an actor, you're a writer. Why don't we do something unusual? Take the profits that we make from all these people buying the food and give it to people who need the money. So that's really what it was. It was just an extemporaneous move. It really wasn't anything planned at all.
What Paul Newman always planned while growing up in Cleveland was to be an actor. He was already on the stage at 11, and at Kenyon College, and then at the Yale Drama School. It was this 1953 appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show that at least got him noticed.
You had a housemaid to clean your floor, but...
And he sang just as badly then.
I'll teach you. Good. It's all in the way you save yourself.
Dissolved to a couple of years later, to a role that first made a difference. A television drama called The Battler. Newman played a punch-drunk boxer.
I think I may be as proud of that performance as anything I've ever done.
Dissolved to William Faulkner's The Long Hot Summer. The actress is Joanne Woodward.
I gave up on you the first time I ever looked into those cold blue eyes.
You got the color right.
I've got everything right, Mr. Quick.
Well, I can see you don't like me, but you're gonna have me. It's gonna be you and me.
30 years later, Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward are still married. We could go on forever.
Well, if there ain't gonna be any rules, let's get the fight started. Someone count 1, 2, 3, go. 1, 2, 3, go.
Paul Newman is Butch Cassidy. Paul Newman is the race car driver. But this week it is Paul Newman the man. He's shy. He's uncomfortable meeting fans, and he doesn't sign autographs. But he has kept up his end of the bargain to the public, as an actor and as a human being.
I have one obligation, and that is to give the best and cleanest, tidiest, meticulous performance that I can, whether it's on the stage or in front of the camera. And I think that's enough.
Of course, he does more, and that's why we choose Paul Newman, a man who says what he thinks and keeps his mouth shut for the most part when he doesn't have anything to say. This week, a man of conscience. That's our report on World News Tonight. I'm Peter Jennings. Have a good weekend. We'll see you here on Monday.